Okay, so I arrived in 1975 in what seemed like a paradise. It was Little Tibet or Ladakh, and it was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen, high on the Tibetan plateau with snow-capped glaciers and amazing emerald green fields and architecture. Almost all the houses looked like little palaces, 3 stories high, painted white, and the most peaceful, beautiful people I had ever encountered. It was just a land of smiles. I'd come out as part of a film team, a German film team, and I was planning to stay for 6 weeks to help make this film, but I fell in love and decided to stay. Fell in love with the culture, with the people. I'd been invited out as a linguist. I'd been living in Paris, working as a linguist. I was a relatively normal Westerner, but I was exceptionally globalized. I was Swedish, English, German, and I had lived in other countries beyond that. I had studied around the world. I had traveled quite extensively. I'd learned to speak 6 languages, and that was why I was invited out as part of the film team. They wanted me to pick up a bit of the language to help make the film. So I decided to stay on, and speaking the language fluently, I realized that I was experiencing something that was a bit like paradise. It took me a couple of years of spending roughly half of every year there before I also became aware that babies didn't cry. You almost never heard a baby crying. I experienced children growing up surrounded by intergenerational community, having such a deep sense of self-respect that they were the most deeply confident and the most deeply humble people I had ever encountered. So I was living with them and experiencing this reality, which was, as I say, like a paradise. And it was interesting that in the early years, almost every outsider that came to Ladakh would say that. What a paradise. What a pity it has to be destroyed, is what they all said. And living with the Ladakhis and speaking the language fluently, I realized that they would be completely dumbfounded if they heard these Westerners saying this, because they were getting the impression that their life was going to be getting even better because of progress and development that was coming in. Ladakh was being opened up to development, to progress, and they had every reason to believe that they would still have their human scale, their human pace of life, their rich, interconnected community and culture, and they would have a lot of amazing material things, lots of money. But the reality, of course, was different. What was being introduced was bringing in, almost overnight, unemployment and competition for scarce resources in the city. It was destroying farmers, pushing people into the city. And if I hadn't happened to read a book called Small is Beautiful by Schumacher, I hope you've heard of it, very important book, I don't know if I would have had the courage or the audacity to try to take on this thing called progress and development. But here was an economist who had experienced something very similar to me. He'd been to Burma and encountered people where there also was no poverty and people were amazingly happy. And he could see that his theories about economic development were wrong. So in his book, he profoundly questioned that. He turned it on its head and he argued for smaller scale, more appropriate ways of doing things. So I started projects, but maybe before that I want to also just say that before I went to Ladakh, I had seen so much of the world and really thought I understood the world. And above all, having studied psychology, I also believed, I think like most Westerners, that human beings, human nature is human nature, and that the cultures are different, but basically we're more or less the same. Now, having lived in Ladakh, I had become convinced that no, it was possible with strong community connection and connection to nature for people to live much more harmonious lives, to die in peace together, to practice medical care in a way where there was much deeper connection between the patient and the doctor, to have a society where there were no homeless people. There were no homeless people. There was no unemployment. There wasn't the poverty that we've seen around the world. But what I experienced is something that very few Westerners alive today have ever experienced. There probably aren't any, because the cultures around the world were transformed hundreds of years ago. The Christian missionaries brought in the idea of original sin and rejecting the body, rejecting your senses. They brought in a very different worldview, from a worldview that accepted nature and human beings as they are. Actually, the worldview was that we are good just the way we are. We don't need a worldview that tells us that there's got to be this constant progress of self-improvement and societal improvement. That concept wasn't there. So what I experienced was profound and very moving. I started, thanks to Schumacher, I started projects to introduce renewable energy as an alternative to fossil fuels. Projects that grew and became quite successful. We worked in 100 villages, and we introduced solar greenhouses and small-scale hydroelectricity. And all of that became one of the biggest appropriate technology projects in the world, and we were lauded for it. I won this alternative Nobel Prize. And all the time I was aware that if there wasn't change in the West, whatever we did in Ladakh was not going to be able to stave off this juggernaut of economic power that was emerging in the hands of global corporations, and that this huge avalanche of change was coming not just to Ladakh but to us. So all of these years, starting already in '77, I was giving talks in the West, America, Europe, and for a long period it was quite difficult. There was a lot of resistance in the West to the idea that we can actually question progress. We can actually question the dominant economic direction. For a while in Ladakh, it also became very difficult because I was, at one point, the pressures of economic development that led to conflict between local people meant that Buddhists and Muslims that had lived side by side for 500 years, there had never been conflict, and they started killing each other. And in Kashmir, a neighboring area, I was accused of being a CIA agent who had started all of this. I had to flee in the night over the Himalayas in a jeep where we couldn't even have the headlights on. I had the princess of Ladakh and my husband John and some of our team in the jeep. The husband of the princess had been part of our projects in Ladakh. So very dramatic things happened. And the difficulty of trying to persuade people in the West is something that has been very, very difficult, I would say, until about 2008, when the financial crisis led to quite a big wake-up. And since that time, there is more and more awareness. And around the world, I've helped to plant seeds. We started the farmers markets here. We've started similar things around the world, starting community-based projects that are actually now part of a global localization movement. But that global localization movement is still invisible in terms of the mainstream media. So many people still haven't heard of it. They haven't seen the amazing, enormous benefits of rebuilding more connected, community-based economies. Food being one of the most important foundations of those new economies, but now there are business alliances, there are local finance networks, there is a movement growing, and I am part now of this global alliance that I've helped to start. I'm a pioneer of the localization movement. We'll be having a conference here in Byron in March, now that's our 24th international conference around the world. So I hope you'll join us. I hope you'll help spread the word about localization as the economics of happiness. Thank you.